Alright guys, so as all of you know, we're expecting Apple's iMac line to finally get redesigned after 8 very long years. And I've been digging deep into Apple's future custom Mac silicon, and I think I figured out exactly what the redesigned 24-inch iMac is gonna look like. And yes, the 24-inch iMac model is the one that we should be expecting either later this year or early next year, so let me quickly explain that before we move on. All of the leaks and rumors are pointing to Apple's lower-end Macs getting Apple silicon chips first, like the entry-level 12-inch MacBook and the 13-inch MacBook Pro. This totally makes sense because those Macs are meant for consumers who run basic apps, browse the web, and stream video, compared to the higher-end Macs which are used for professional work. Like the 27-inch iMac that just got refreshed with killer specs, and it's been performing very well in all of our recent testing. Now on the other hand, the 21.5-inch iMac model didn't get updated with new specs for the first time in many years, which is the nail in the coffin, which confirms all of the rumors of a 24-inch iMac redesign with Apple silicon chips coming very soon, specifically within the next 7 months. So let's get into exactly what I think the iMac redesign will look like and why it makes a whole lot of sense. And not just the 24-inch, but the larger model as well, which is rumored to be coming in the second half of next year with a custom Apple GPU. My speculations on the redesign start all the way back in 2011 with the older design of the iMac. As you can see, the internals were packed to the brim, basically using all of the available space they could for things like the hard drive, the disk drive, the speakers, and much more. And from the side, you can tell that this was a pretty thick iMac. And the year after that, Apple redesigned it with a thinner body that they're still using in 2020. And as you can see, the internals are quite a bit smaller, so they decided to put larger speaker enclosures to fill the gaps. Now fast forward to 2020 and we now have a new teardown from OWC that reveals similar internals, but a whole lot of extra room now that they've gone away with the physical hard drive. And just watch what happens when they remove the speaker enclosures. Most of the outdated iMac case is still being unused. Now before I dig deep into the rest of those internals and what I believe is going to happen to them on the Apple silicon models, I want to switch over to what the new design will look like on the exterior. Way back in 2011, Apple released the 27-inch Thunderbolt display to replace the Apple Cinema display. Then on October 20th of 2012, just over a year later, Apple introduced the fully redesigned iMac with an identical display with the same aspect ratio and the same resolution. It looked almost identical except that the iMac had a chin on the bottom, and then the 21.5-inch model was basically the same except scaled down. Now this brings us to June 3rd, 2019, when Apple revealed the Pro Display Xdr that went on sale in December. From the front, the rounded corners and black bezels look very similar to an iPad Pro, with flat edges on the side as well. And when you're looking from the side, the Pro Display Xdr is quite a bit thick, and that's because the casing has the passive cooling vents that are milled out of a solid block of aluminum to match the Mac Pro's design. That adds extra thickness, and it's a high-end multi-layer display that outputs a ton of light for HDR editing. Now, if you've been following the 24-inch iMac redesign rumors, there were many leaks pointing to Apple redesigning the iMac with an iPad Pro-like design, which is basically what the Pro Display Xdr already looks like. The only problem is that the Pro Display Xdr is a bit bulky, having thick sides and a large bulky stand. So here's what I think the redesigned iMac is gonna look like and how Apple is gonna achieve it. On the front side, it'll look just like the Pro Display Xdr with the same thin bezels, except that it'll have a chin on the bottom with a small Apple logo. Why the chin? Well, because the iMac has always had the chin. It needs to have the chin. If the 2012 27-inch iMac didn't have a chin, it would literally be identical to the Thunderbolt display when looking at it from the front. Apple needs to make sure that when you see an iMac, you know it's an iMac. And we do, because it's always had a chin. And the same thing goes for the redesigned Apple Silicon iMac. It's gonna have a chin with an Apple logo, except that I think the chin is gonna be a little bit smaller. But by how much? I don't know, but it'll probably be smaller than the massive chin we currently have. The sides of the iMac are going to be flat, just like the Pro Display Xdr, except that I believe the sides are actually going to be a bit thinner. Now the interesting part is that I think the newly redesigned iMac is going to have a totally flat back. No more hump like we have currently on the iMac. It'll be flat, just like the Pro Display Xdr, except that it won't have the same cheese grater vents. Now you might be asking, how is Apple gonna fit the guts or the internals of the iMac with it being thinner than the Pro Display Xdr and not having a hump? Well, first off, the hump design is not gonna work with thick flat edges because that's exactly how the 2011 iMac looked like, and Apple won't be going back to that design. Apple wants their new iMac to look modern for a new modern Apple Silicon chip and a new modern macOS design. And if you think about it, all three of those things come from the iPad Pro, which looks modern with its flat sides, already has a modern Apple Silicon chip, and as you already know, macOS Big Sur looks a whole lot like iPadOS 14. So Apple is going all in with the new rounded corner and flat edge look, which is exactly what the iPhone 12 is gonna look like as well. The iPad Air 4 is also rumored to be taking on the same design as the current iPad Pro. This makes sense for Apple to do because this transition is a massive one, and by the time it's finished, all of Apple's flagship devices are gonna look very similar design-wise. Now getting back to how Apple can fit all of those internals in a flat and thin iMac, this brings us to that teardown of the 2020 iMac from OWC. This right here is the guts of the current 27-inch iMac, which is now smaller this year because the hard drive is now gone, since it comes with an SSD at the base price. It's absolutely tiny compared to the size of the iMac. Now of course, this is the 27-inch model, but this logic board without the hard drive is also now pretty small in the 21.5-inch model as well. Now here is that same iMac with the power supply removed. It becomes even smaller. Now once he takes out the main board and flips it over, we see the reason for the hump on the iMac. There are two quite large heat sinks, one for the CPU and one for the graphics chip. And along with that, we have the user upgradable RAM that sticks out quite a bit. So it makes sense why Apple used this design in the 2012 iMac. And now let's finally get into the design of the Apple Silicon iMac and how it can easily have thin sides and a completely flat back. If you've watched some of my videos on the Apple Silicon chips, you'll know that they're designed to run very efficiently, using much less power than Intel chips. And you'll also know that Apple is ditching the AMD GPU and going with their own custom Apple GPU, which will be integrated into the main SoC. So let's take a look at that logic board again. On the Apple Silicon Macs, there obviously won't be a hard drive, which is already missing on the current iMac. With Apple Silicon, that huge power supply on the left side is going away. Since the graphics will be integrated into the main SoC, we no longer need all of that space for that chip on the right side, or its massively thick heatsink. And since Apple Silicon is going to be more efficient, the socketed Intel CPU and its thick heatsink is going away. It'll likely have a much thinner cooling design like on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. And the large fan no longer needs to be that large anymore. They can make it thinner and more spread out thanks to all of that extra space. The user replaceable RAM that is also quite a bit thick is most likely going away, which is a bit sad, but it makes sense for an Apple Silicon chip, which integrates everything into one SoC. Now, if you think about it, everything is going to be soldered onto the main board. The Apple Silicon chip, the RAM, the storage, and the power supply will be built in. The cooling system will be much smaller than before since there's no need for a dedicated graphics chip that takes a huge amount of power. And the Apple Silicon chip itself takes much less power than an Intel CPU. Basically, the main board is going to be much thinner than before, and all of the leftover empty space can be filled up by the speaker enclosures, which will be thinner and more spread out. So it totally makes sense for the guts of the iMac to fit into a chassis that's thinner than the Pro Display Xdr. And finally, I think the stand is going to look very similar to the one on that display, which is already shaped like an iPad Pro, except that the stand will obviously be included for the same price and permanently attached to the back like on the current iMac. So there you guys have it. That's my speculation for the redesigned iMac. It'll look just like the Pro Display Xdr, with the same rounded corners, the same thin bezels, except with a chin that's likely going to be smaller than the current one. The sides will be flat, and it'll be thinner overall with a flat back. The 24-inch iMac will get it first, probably within the next 7 months, and then the larger iMac will likely get the redesign in the second half of next year. If you agree with my speculation on the redesign, let me know down in the comment section below, and be sure to check out our Apple product merch like our ARM Apple Silicon t-shirt or our mask down in the merch shelf below. And if you can't wait to see this new iMac redesign, click the circle above to subscribe for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.